Hello, nonprofit leaders. I'm Sarah Olivieri, your host, and this podcast is here to assist people like you, executive directors, board members, and other nonprofit leaders make a bigger impact with insights, tips, and lessons learned from nonprofit leaders and experts. Having been an executive director, a board member, and now a consultant and coach, I truly understand the challenges you face. And that's why I'm here. I'm all about working smarter, not harder, so you can make a bigger impact without the burnout. And so is our sponsor, DonorBox. DonorBox isn't just a suite of helpful fundraising tools, it's a partner that helps you raise more money and supports you in retaining your donors. I love their forward-thinking approach. Visit donorbox.org to learn more. And don't forget to sign up for the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter, where you'll get bite-sized, actionable tips just for nonprofit leaders like you, delivered weekly to your inbox. Sign up at inspirednonprofitleadership.com/sign up. Okay, let's dive into today's episode. And today we're going to be talking about soft skills, and my guest expert is a facilitator and certified executive coach with over 40 years of senior leadership and management experience. John Whitehead has held senior operational positions with national organizations, achieving significant recognition for his results. Along with his executive and leadership coaching practice, John is currently a corporate trainer at Okanagan College, British Columbia, Canada, and was previously an adjunct professor at the Faculty of Management at the University of British Columbia. He travels internationally and describes himself as a continuous learner, motivated to learn more so that he can better help others achieve their goals. Welcome, John. Before we dive into soft skills, will you just tell us a little more about yourself personally to round you out as a whole person?
Oh, great introduction. I know I send you that intro, but when you hear it being read back, you go, "Oh my goodness, is that what actually was happening?" I've had the pleasure of working on both for-profit and nonprofit organizations, and so I've seen both sides of that. And when you talk about being a leader in those organizations, there are definitely nuances between working in a for-profit and a not-profit. But when it comes down to leadership, when it comes down to leading people, there's really no difference. We're dealing with people. And one of the things that I learned when I went back to school, and I tell folks that here's somebody that barely passed high school. I think my math teacher took pity on me to give me a passing grade so I could pass high school. So, and then when I turned 50, decided to go back to school to do a master's degree. And in that program, that's where I really learned what it really means to be a continuous learner, to listen, to what the importance of communication. And that's where I really found out more about myself and how I personally tend to behave, how I tend to communicate. And that was a huge, it was a mind-blowing experience for me that I've now been able to use as I work with other leaders in different types of organizations.
Yeah, I love that. And I love, we talk about a growth mindset and continuous learning, but I think we throw those words around a little loosely sometimes. And as you were talking, it reminded me where I went to college, they had this phrase that was just kind of ever present, and it was the life of the mind. And I'm realizing that's not a concept that I hear out there, but when I work with my own clients, one of the things we talk about is brain space, time to be thinking, because besides people, I think the other big thing leaders often need to be doing is thinking. So, but let's go into, you want to add something to that? Go ahead.
Definitely, because one of my mentors, when I first moved into leadership, one of the things he told me, and I still do it to this day, and it's a piece that I talk to my clients about, is he said, make sure that you put at least 2 hours a week aside for thinking, for reading. And that was back in the old days when we still had paper calendars, and I would take the day and I would hash off the space to block it in. And so that we would have this, and he said, use it for if there's an article you've been wanting to read, or if there's a book that you're reading, or you need to catch up on something that you're involved in. Use that time for that. So the thinking piece is critical.
Yeah. And today, I mean, I do that in my Google Calendar. I just put in big bars. My calendar is mostly green coded. And so I'm like, whoop. And I just label it block so I don't get hung up. And that way there's nice long chunks of unscheduled time.
Let's think of this in the context of leaders in organizations. Everything's being thrown at you as a leader. You're putting out the next fire that's coming along. And so I think it's critical you have that space so you don't schedule anything else in that space to give you that time. Otherwise, it just doesn't happen.
That's right. That's right. And when a fire happens, you need to be free. My mother became a leader, taking over the small private school I had went to. And she did it for 17 years. And in the last year, she really, knew what she was doing. And I asked her one day, so, what did you do with your time? She said, honestly, I spent a lot of the time playing Sudoku on my computer. Because that way she was present in her office, not getting sucked into things unnecessarily, but available for whatever came up. And to me, that lesson was hold that space and time to be available suddenly. Because if you're always maxed out, what do you do when something bad happens that needs your attention?
Exactly.
I love it. So let's talk about soft skills, and we'll start with the basic question. What is a soft skill?
A soft skill. Let's put it in this context. Most people, when they go to school, speaking to learning, most people when they go to school, they learn a trade. They learn a skill set. They learn how to program computers. They learn how to fix a car. They learn how, medical school, you go and learn to be a doctor. So you learn these technical skills, which can also be referred to as hard skills. So think of your hard skills as those technical skills that we learn to do our job. Soft skills then are the people side, the relational side of those skill sets, which unfortunately not much is really taught in schools. People come out of schools brilliantly trained, brilliant individuals with a learned trade or learned skill, whatever that might be, whether it's as an auto mechanic or as a pediatrician. So they've got that down pat. And then they're thrown into the world where they have to relate to people now. And they don't. And so I know there was an organization that I was following a number of years ago, and their number one client were banks. And they were being brought in to do soft skills training with MBA students that had just come out of university. Because although they were brilliant and they all had their MBAs, the people skill side, not so much. So that's how so we're talking about how we communicate, how we interconnect with other people. And then that will lead down to include other things like how we manage our time as well, for how we make decisions sometimes even.
Yeah, I was just on a virtual summit today, and there was a session on setting boundaries. And one thing that struck me, which I would consider a soft skill, the presenter said, most people in our culture don't learn how to set boundaries until they're in their 30s or 40s, which just exemplifies, what you just said. We're not teaching these things to kids and young adults.
Yeah, and I just came across an old blog post that I'd written a number of years ago, and it was about saying thank you. And I read it. I wrote in that blog, if you go to the Google and you type in how to say thank you, the huge numbers of websites come up, and it makes you think, we actually need that?
Yeah, and it's not the same in different cultures either. So talk to me a little bit more about, what do you see as the difference between like soft skills, emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and communication. Break those apart for me a little, and maybe you can throw in some examples along the
For
way,
sure.
or put them all together,
Yeah,
whatever
for
direction
sure.
you want to go.
So my focus tends to be on how we as individuals behave and how we tend to communicate. And there's a ton of research around it. And one of the pieces of research says that by the time we're 12 or 13, we're basically personality-wise, we're basically stuck where we are, unless something significant happens to us psychologically, or we have a frontal lobotomy. Those personality traits won't change. However, we can learn to shift our behavior. And so we might have, for example, I was working with an individual who was what we might call a type A personality. If you've done the DISC profile, he's a D in the DISC. In fact, he's a DD in the DISC. This individual was a general supervisor in a mine setting. I had the benefit of working with him on site on the mine, which was kind of a cool experience in itself. And one of the things we were working with him on was how to need to slow down. He was just very fast. If you think of type A, making decisions quickly, not really listening. So it was about slowing down and listening. And he was so much of a D that when I was following him around the plant, I was literally running to keep up with him. He was that fast. Anyway, one day, several months after I'd been working with him, I walked into his office and he said, "John, I have to tell you a story." He said, "When I was out shopping with my wife last night, and she turned to me and said, you seem to be listening more." And of course, part of me goes, yes, right? Because that's the need for him to recognize that for his to be the leader he needed to be in that space needed to be that he needed to be slowing down and listening more. Right? So it's about that then is how communication is linked to behavior, because it's shifting that behavior. Now, the interesting thing is, and I bring this up in my workshops, is if we think emotional intelligence is about understanding ourselves, right? Controlling ourselves, understanding others, and then how we relate to others. I use that 4-quadrant version of emotional intelligence from 2 authors called Sparrow and Knight. And by getting people to recognize themselves first and then recognize other people, talking about how we communicate and behave, we're actually increasing that emotional intelligence. We're increasing that emotional quotient by doing that. Another little story, actually the same fellow, I shouldn't be picking on this guy, but anyway, one of his biggest complaints was he never had enough time to do his work. He was always complaining about, "I never have time to complete my work." And as I was observing him as his coach, one of the things I noticed were people were coming into his office all the time to put out fires. "Hey, boss, we've got a problem with," and what would he do? "Well, this is what you do." So he got to slow down and just make one little shift. And that was when somebody walked in his office, he was to say, "What do you think we should be doing?" And I said, "Yes, that might take a little bit more time up front. But over time, what might we observe?" This is what we observed. People started walking in saying, "Boss, we've got a problem. This is what we should be doing. Oh, this is what I think we should do." Now, I said, they might come in and it might be not a solution you think would work, but instead of then diving in, just say, "Can you think of something else?" So in other words, using a coach approach, as you know, Sarah, using that coach approach, asking questions, getting them to figure it out. And over time, that's actually what started to happen. So he could eventually say, "Yes, you know what you're doing, just go do it," which freed up his time eventually. So again, it's that how we communicate with people is not only shifting our own behaviors, but shifting other people's behaviors as well in that context.
And that's that leader, not as boss, but leader as a guide, as a trainer, as someone who brings the team along, which it makes your job easier and makes the whole organization stronger. I think that's really key.
Yeah. So the key is, in my world, it's not enough to understand ourselves and understand how we're communicating, behaving, but it's taking it to the next step and recognizing where our people are that we're working with. What are their particular styles? And then what do they need in terms of communicating? So, for example, one of the stories I tell a lot is on the disc, I'm an I. And when I come home from IKEA, I open up the flat pack, and what do? I just start putting stuff together. Why? Because I like to have fun doing it. Forget the instructions. I'll just stop. Yes, there's a chair back, or I may have to take. In fact, upstairs right now, there is a chair with the base still upside down, right? But that's what I wanted. I'll just go figure it out. Now, an analytical or an ask in the DISC, a C in the disk model, analytical a C. When they come home from IKEA, they open up the flat box, and what do? What do you think they do?
Oh, I'm going to say they pull out the instructions.
Yeah. And what else do they
check
do?
for all the pieces.
Yes. And they count all the pieces.
That's right.
Now, you put me and that person together in the workplace. So if I recognize I'm working with somebody who is an analytical person, then maybe I need to slow down and give them and recognize they need that time. Now, I may not give them forever because we still have to get the work done, but at least I'm not going, oh, let's just go do it. I'm recognizing that person needs a little bit of time. And hopefully that person is recognizing that John just wants to go and do it and have fun. So maybe I need to speed it up a bit. So think about this in emotional intelligence sense. What we're doing is we're building each other's EQ. So we're learning how do we interact with one another to prevent that knocking of heads. So if we can figure that out, the workplace can be a much better place, a much happier place to work in.
Yeah, I love that thinking around how they're kind of building on each other, right? You have to have a certain amount of your own emotional intelligence about yourself to show up and be ready to listen. And then the more you listen, the more you can gain those skills in understanding how other people are, and the more you can then learn about yourself. And so everybody is leveling up, which seems to be a theme here.
Yeah.
How did you come to this place of learning about emotional intelligence, soft skills, and making that an important part of your professional life?
Well, the organization I used to work for before I opened my own practice, they used a model called social style, which is a more simplified version of DISC. It's comes by Traycom. I call it DISC for dummies. I really shouldn't, but it's just because it's a more simpler, stripped down, I think more accessible version of the DISC profile. And the organization I worked for, they used that as part of their onboarding. So we used it in the field. We used it when we went to work with clients. We used it internally. And I was rising up in one of the things I found in my personal life was it didn't matter what role I was in, within 6 months to a year, I was being promoted to either a trainer or a manager role. And in 2008, my boss came to me and said, we'd like you to put together a leadership development program for the organization. I remember looking him in the eye and saying, I have no frigging idea what I'm doing. I just do it. And so what I did was that's when I decided to go back to school. But what that really was for me is forcing me to then figure out, okay, why do I do what I do? Why am I being asked to be in these leadership roles? And so it was that growth of self-awareness that then led me down the coaching world, because I recognize what it was helpful for me. So how can I help other people with this?
Yeah. So it's interesting, thinking about certain qualities that naturally lend people towards being a leader. I remember having different circumstance, but recognizing that kind of in myself. I was like, why? Like, if I'm in a group, I don't try to be the leader, but people are usually like, you do it, Sarah. But even when I'm like shopping in a store, people are asking me for my opinion on what they're buying. And I guess there's just something about me that makes people feel like that would be a good thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not sure what's going on there. Maybe we're throwing off something, some different types of vibes. But even as a kid being picked to be the captain of my soccer team, right? Being the youngest manager that this shoe company I worked for had ever had when I was 18, becoming a store manager, and then moving in other organizations and becoming a trainer, or that connection with other people. I think a lot of it is about about relationships and building those relationships and making those connections with people. Being an eye on the disc profile helps a little bit, I think. But don't if you're not, that doesn't mean you can't do it. I think we can learn to enhance those behaviors we have, those abilities that we have. And that's what it means about the continuous learning bit is always, okay, what else, what else should I maybe be working on? What is the other piece that I maybe want to just shift a little bit? It's not that we're doing anything wrong or terrible, but maybe it's just that little incremental shift that
Yeah,
will
small
work.
changes can make big differences. I want to ask you, since you have so many years of experience, what are kind of the things that you see come up again and again that are either challenges for leaders or behaviors that pretty much they all need to exhibit in some way?
Well, let's generalize and say everybody. Let's just say that my opening bit or my elevator pit spiel is people ask me what I do, and I'll say to them, "Well, have you been having a conversation with somebody, sir, and you've been saying A, B, C, and the other person's hearing X, Y, Z, and you go, and everybody, sir, everybody goes, oh yeah, all the time." It's that fundamental piece of how we communicate with one another. It really is. It comes down because that's where everything else builds up from, right? So it doesn't matter who I work with or what organization I'm working with. I will start with that bit. I will start with that self-awareness of who I am and how do I tend to communicate and behave. Recognizing it's situational, but there is a preference that we all have. I think of it in terms of neighborhoods. So, we may have to, neighborhood is where we feel the most comfortable, where we live, where we go home at the end of the day and go, oh, I'm home. This is where I belong. It doesn't mean that we don't have to leave our neighborhood to do other things. We may have to leave a neighborhood to go get milk and bread, to go to school or go to work. But there's that place that we build. So I think of who we are at the base, at the fundamental level, is that neighborhood. But how do we then work in those other neighborhoods? How do we meet other people that are in those neighborhoods? And even within that neighborhood, of course, there are going to be some variations. So I could be living in my neighborhood 2 streets over as somebody else who's slightly different. We're basically the same, but we're slightly different. How do we meet? How do I work with that person that goes to IKEA and likes to count every frigging piece before they put the thing together? Right. That ability. So I think it means that what it really means is we can't put ourselves in that neighborhood box. I think that's one of the dangerous things that can happen is putting ourselves in this box or putting other people in the box and say that's who they are. Because no, they will behave based on the situation, but recognizing they do have that fundamental space that they prefer to be in. So if I can create a space for that person that's closer to that fundamental place in the workplace, great. If I know they need to cross every T and dot every I, give them the space to do that.
Yeah. And I love that, I just love this IKEA example too. Because I'm the person who opens the box. I don't need to count the pieces, but I'm going to look at the instructions. I'm going to assess whether or not I feel the instructions were written well. And then if I think they were, then I will assume that that's probably the best process for putting this together, and I'm going to follow that process. But I have a whole nother process for building an IKEA thing with somebody else, in which case first I'm assessing, is this the kind of person who's just going to dive in, do it, and get it done? Or is this, in which case I'll be like, I'm just going to leave them to it. That's great. I don't need to help build it. I'll go in the other room. Or is this the kind of person who's going to dive in and then have made a hot mess and be like, help, I don't know what to do. And if they're that person, I know that I can calmly like sit kind of nearby, keep track of what steps have been done and what steps have been missed so that when they freak out and ask for help, I'll have followed along and jump in to kind of get back on the process and get it done. But these are learned skills from like literally having built furniture with people. It's a real life thing that we get through.
Right. Well, I was working with a client who's a forestry supervisor, and he was saying that one of his biggest issues was he was working with a bunch of eyes. He had a bunch of eyes on his team. And the problem was they'd go out and get into the bush, and guys had left equipment in the yard. Like how? He says, yelling at them doesn't work. Ragging on them doesn't work. So again, when I work with clients, I'm trying to get them to figure out what are some of the things you can do? What are some of the ways? Why is this bothering you? What are some of the things you might be able to do? And what he did, and I thought this was brilliant, he came up with the idea of in the yard before they left, they would have a safety meeting, tailgate meetings is what they call them. And what he did was he got his list of things he needed, and he would say them out loud. Oh, I just want to make sure. Do I have this? Yes. Do I have that? Yes. Do I have that? And he said, what he noticed, everybody else was going, oh. Now, it didn't solve the problem completely, but it made a heck of a difference, right? Of showing leadership, doing it, demonstrating it, making an example, but doing it, not obvious or anything, just off to the side. Oh, do I have this? Do I have that? Oh, yeah, I need that. I need that. People was doing it. So recognizing you're not going to change those people. You can't change, right? We can't change other people. But maybe what we can do is over time, get them to shift their behavior by creating some sort of process for that. So like you said, watching how they're putting that footage together. What might they be missing? What are they, and so I'm ready to step in when I need to step in.
That's right. That's right. Before we run out of time, because there's so many things we could talk about with leadership, I'm wondering, in your experience with nonprofit leaders specifically, and I totally agree with what you said earlier. Leadership is leadership. Just like being a good teacher is being a good teacher. Doesn't really matter what subject you're teaching. A great teacher could teach just about anything. But are there any differences, or maybe just difference in proportion of where nonprofit leaders need to put attention versus for-profit leaders?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good question, Sarah. And I think nonprofit leaders, they may have some other than other leaders. One of the uniquenesses, they have more direct connection with their boards, maybe especially EEs in organizations. CEOs of organizations will have more connection with their boards, and so those are. Unfortunately, a number of the nonprofit leaders I've worked with, it's challenging with the boards that have been one of the pieces. And a lot of it, again, comes down to how they communicate and understanding how they communicate. So it's not, in leadership, we've been talking about leading down. There's a lot of this leading up to and how we communicate, and being a leader upwards too is important. There's more of that when you've got these board relationship, a nonprofit board relationship. And you may not, depending on the nonprofit, I've worked with a couple of nonprofits where the boards are, again, really individuals are highly esteemed, high qualified, technical people. But we're having to, how do we work now as a board to get run the operation, how it needs to run? And I've had the privilege of being chairing a nonprofit board as well, and how you bring those people in together as a unified when they're a lot of them are so diverse on that board. I bring them together. So I think in nonprofit leaders, I've seen in my experience, that's been one of the biggest challenges for that. The human side, I maybe I shouldn't say this, but I think the reality is the human relationship side, and nonprofits is that there's a there is a difference there as well. It shouldn't be, whether it's profit motivated or nonprofit motivated, but I think there's a bit of a difference that we have to be careful and watch for.
Yeah, I see that. I see kind of two opposing things. I see people in the nonprofit space tend to be very like heart driven, giving of themselves, and then they can be prone to overgiving. And that kind of leads to like the dark side of the nonprofit space is there's a real culture of underpaying people and asking people to work more than you probably should or give more of themselves without really appropriate compensation. And so there's kind of this, yeah, I don't have a better word for it than the dark side.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right, because then the staff, the individuals working in the nonprofits too, they often have that feeling that they want to, as you said, they've got that they want to give. And so it's recognizing, no, you know what? You don't volunteer in the organization you work for. If you want to volunteer, that's great. Find something else to volunteer. I face this in an organization. I'm on a committee right now, almost like an HR committee within this nonprofit. And that's one of the things we're doing is we're making sure our staff, who we find are working all these extra hours, we actually made them put a timesheet in place so we could track their hours because they were being seriously underpaid. And it was because they felt, well, we're volunteering. No, you're not volunteering. This is a paid position. Find something else outside the organization if you want to volunteer. That's fine. We'll support you on that. But let's make sure that we're compensating you and you're working, you're being compensated for the actual work you're putting in. Right. Yeah, exactly. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Depending on the type of nonprofit, like I was working with one of my nonprofits I worked with was a food bank. And again, making sure the staff are being paid the living wage that allows them not to necessarily be clients of the place they're actually working in as well.
Right. It's so important. And it starts with leaders. I see so many leaders who underpay themselves. I actually, to the point, because what gets measured, or let's make it seeable even if we can't change it yet. So I've had executive directors, rather than take a pay cut, give a donation back. Right? So at the end of the day, it costs a little more in payroll, but now it's the executive director who's in the driver's seat, and they see it. They have to see their donation, and it's on the books,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
this executive director is literally giving tens of thousands of dollars a year for the privilege of their organization having the ability to afford for them to keep working there.
Yeah.
And then once it's seen, usually they're back up not needing to make that donation within 6 months.
Right.
Because it's so glaringly obvious.
Yes.
And they take action.
Yeah.
And they do what's necessary
Yeah.
to bring in the funds. I love it. Any final words of wisdom for leaders out there? And as you share that, or after you share that also, what kind of leaders should be getting in touch with you, and what's the best way to do that?
Sure. One piece of wisdom that I work with my clients on, and we're constantly talking about it, fits neatly with some of the things we've been talking about today so far. And that is, there are things we can control. There are things we can't control. What are we focusing on? And oftentimes I'll be in a coaching session and somebody who's going on about something, and I'll ask them, I'm curious how much control you have over that. Okay. So where should your attention be based on what we're talking about? Oh, yes. Things you have no control over, but we focus, right? We have that negative bias. We want to focus on what the things we can't control. So for words of, I'll leave you with that piece of words of wisdom. And in terms of who I work with, it's senior and emerging leaders. I find that I'm working a lot with emerging leaders. These are high potentials that have been identified, that the organization feels that there may be something missing in their soft skill toolkit, and have asked me to and invited me to come in and work with these individuals. So it doesn't really matter to the organization whether it's profit or nonprofit. It tends to be all over the map. And it's really funny, since pandemic, I really have no clients locally. Well, I correct that. I just have gained a local client, but I have clients all over the world. I just finished working with a client in Japan. Right. The biggest challenge there is just not remembering what time zone, but what day they're in. But so in terms of, it's just, if somebody's just, they have a sense that there's something missing in their soft skill toolkit usually around the communication piece. I'm more than happy to have just what we call in our industry a discovery conversation. Let's have just an initial chat, no obligation whatsoever, just to see what you're looking for, and if you think it's maybe something you want to explore.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, John, for your time and your expertise. And thank you out there for tuning in and for everything you do to make our communities better. I have a small favor to ask of you, which is please take a moment to like and review this podcast wherever you listen to it, and share it with a friend or colleague who could benefit from these conversations. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, nonprofits are more complex than for-profits, but you can win the game of nonprofit whack-a-mole by working smarter, not harder.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.